Hi, I'm Tansy Brooke, the Senior Director of ERP Innovation Product Marketing at Oracle. And today I'm joined by Heather Whiteman. Heather is an expert in people analytics, talent transformation, and the future of work. Heather, it's so great to be speaking with you today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to talk with you.
So how did you first get interested in people and analytics?
Yeah, funny enough, I started out in monkey psychology, and I really thought I'd be an animal researcher at this point. But I came across some articles and some papers around how you can use data to identify and remove bias in an employment setting. And this idea that we could use data to really affect people's lives in where they work, the possibilities that they have in terms of employment and growth, it was mesmerizing. And I really just spent the next years of my life focused on this idea around how do we capture all of this great information around people? And especially, how do we get into analytics and data around squishy things like humans? And how can we use that to really improve workplaces? And it's been a real passion over the last few years, both in applied settings and then more recently being able to spend time in the classroom and sharing more about it.
I think there's a lot of concern around the relationship between people and technology. And obviously, we're constantly seeing examples of ways that technology is not great for people. And I'm wondering, what do you think the benefits are of people and technology working together?
I definitely agree. We do see some examples of technology maybe creating or at least perpetuating some bad outcomes. But I don't think that's because technology does that. In fact, I think technology is one of the best ways that we could think about really reimagining our workplaces and using data, technology, and information to make it better. On our own, we may not be able to find the patterns and get the insights to solve these intractable problems, like bias or harm or just increasing opportunities. But when you leverage data and technology, you become so much smarter and you have the ability to go after these big problems. So while some people see technology as this big, bad, scary thing making terrible things happen, I see technology as a tool, and it could be one of the strongest tools we have for really changing that. It just goes about, how do you use it? How do you implement it? How do you apply it? And I think that's where we're seeing some really cool opportunities for technology to change that conversation.
The difference between technology for people versus technology about people. Can you tell me a little bit about that concept?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in people analytics, HR analytics, data and talent discussions, but too often there's this heavy reliance on data about people. It's reporting, it's turnover numbers, it's assessments, it's surveys. But if you start from that question, you miss some of the most powerful parts of data. If you use data for people rather than about people, that's where you start to ask questions that can be informed by information and really changes the direction. So when I like to talk about analytics, I like to think about analytics for people, especially when we can build it into our systems, our processes, and things moving forward. I'll just give you an example or two, but rather than using analytics to predict employee attrition, we're living in a great resignation right now, and some might use data to try to predict how many people are going to leave. What if we flip that question around and said, how do we use analytics and data for people? And we start to understand what are the things that will really motivate employees and connect with them on a personal level that can bring about a great retention rather than a great resignation. But it's in that switch. It's about analytics for people, not just about people.
I feel like we're at a really exciting time because we have a lot of emerging technologies that are coming out that provide us with capabilities that we didn't have in the past. For example, for a number of years, I worked in federal and state grant evaluation. And one of the challenges that we saw often was the limitations of assessment. For example, there was a middle school that we were evaluating the proficiency of their program. And this was a school where the students that were coming in were often 2 or 3 years behind where they were supposed to be. So it was a middle school. And by the time that they left the school, they were often only a year behind. And so it's actually a really exceptional program. But at that time, the assessment we had was basically rating schools whether or not they were proficient or not proficient. And so you have this program that's really phenomenal, but because of the metrics that we had in place, you weren't getting a comprehensive view of what was actually going on. I feel like we're at a place where tapping into emerging technology and the abundance of data that we have available is we're hitting a tipping point of being able to really change the game. Can we measure people in more holistic ways? Can we provide richer assessment to really help out employees? And I'm curious, what are you seeing in terms of the opportunities to be able to see people as more holistic?
Yeah, a couple of great things in that example that I'd love to hit on, kind of 2 points. First, I'll start with how wonderful that example is as a way to highlight what I see in organizations often, which is this desire to have metrics that aren't necessarily designed for the outcomes that we want. So we might pick up a metrics approach, say employee performance, or in your case, whether or not students were meeting the particular level. But did anybody ask, is this the right assessment for this particular purpose at this particular time? And I think that is part of the issue where we see problems with quantification of people, is many times the measurements are powerful and they are useful if used in the right context. So when I think about an employee context, for example, employee performance measured against some arbitrary set of metrics is not going to be fair to an employee who is in a job that is not well fit or suited to their skills, capabilities, interests, and motivations. And so to shove those numbers on a person in an area that's maybe not the right fit, it has more harm than if we had talked about a conversation around how do we measure impact? How do we measure potential? How do we connect it? Another thing that you were just talking about was how do we think about the impact of data when it forces us to reduce down to just a number. I would hate if somebody thought that all I was 37. That's who I am. That's who Heather boils down to, 37 on some scale. Nobody is a single data point. Nobody is even a set of multiple data points. But I think that there is an opportunity to use data and analytics in a holistic way that gives us a better picture of the whole person. And a person is more than just who they are at work. There is a lot of information that we can have there, but as we've seen during the pandemic, there are aspects about our productivity, things like burnout, well-being, that you can't measure in the workplace context alone. You have to understand things like support systems or external pressures that are infecting someone. And when we think about information and data about the whole human, we can get a little better to an understanding that can help us set up a more positive employee experience, that can connect it more to having data that's for the person to help them have a better outcome rather than just about the person, like productivity numbers or performance ratings or some other quantified piece. So I think there's a lot in that conversation, but we're getting to a place now where people are getting a little more comfortable, or at least asking for new types of data and new ways of understanding people that we can apply. And I do think that's helping a little bit.
I think in the last year, with the Great Resignation, talent has become front and center for all lines of business. It seems like traditionally a lot of the focus has been in the HR function, but today, everyone from supply chain to finance to marketing is very much aware of the impact that talent shortages can have on their business. And it seems like in many ways this is an opportunity for companies to reconsider how they interact with their employees. And I'm curious if you have a point of view on what are really the opportunities that the organization has, not just within HR, but also within the other lines of business to really sort of rethink how they approach and how they interact with their employees.
The Great Resignation really does just come down to employees redesigning how they're wanting to work, where they're wanting to work, and the kinds of organizations that they're willing to work with. And I think that's a great cue for leaders to follow, is this is a new time. Employees are choosing to redesign. Are you redesigning. If you're a leader in the HR or talent space, how are you thinking about really setting up a new employee experience, one that is going to welcome in the individuals who want to join an organization like yours? If you're in the finance areas, how are you thinking about not just the dollar values behind what you do, but the value in human capital? And how do you think about it as an asset and the processes that are involved there? And for our leaders in the operational space, there are three main things that hold up all of our operations, and they are people, process, and technology. I'm sure a lot of attention is paid to the process and technology, but is enough attention paid to the people? And if not, I think this is that opportunity, just as employees are redesigning where they want to be, and we're seeing that in the form of many people choosing to not work, or to not work where they currently are at least. That's an opportunity for leaders to really respond and to address it with their own redesign of the workplace.
I'm curious, how do you see the opportunity for HR professionals for the first time being able to sort of quantify these types of areas that in the past was very difficult to quantify?
HR professionals are in a very difficult time. Not only are people one of the hardest things to measure, but then we throw in all the complexities of the new questions that are being posed today. So I completely understand how HR professionals today not only feel like they might not have the data or the information, but also they're being asked these really complicated human questions, like what is well-being during a global pandemic in our workplace with all of the constraints that are ever changing? What is burnout? How does it affect us? How do we think about it in the context? What is social support? All of these questions have been tricky questions for anyone. I mean, these are hard, complex questions. It's not as simple as maybe the physical sciences. This is hard stuff. So for those who feel that maybe there's a difficulty in using data and analytics to really support our people practices, I'd say, yeah. It's hard stuff. And so it can be daunting, it can be challenging to get started. But the nice thing is we have never had more data or more easy to use technology that has helped us jump past what some of the problems were in the past. It'll never be very easy to truly understand people in all their complexity, but you no longer have to be a data scientist or a statistician, which I think held some HR people back before because not everybody loves the idea of statistics. But these days, you don't need that kind of background to get valuable insights. You can use the data that's available. You can use all of the advances that we have in our new cloud information systems that are enabling us to have the information at the data. You just have to get practiced at how do I ask the right kind of data-driven questions, and how do I effectively use evidence. And by the way, evidence doesn't always have to come in a number. It might come in the form of employee experience, inputs, and sentiment. But how do I use evidence to really drive my decisions forward? And so for those who are struggling or find it hard today, I'd say, first of all, give yourself a break. It is really, really hard. It's not you, it's the data. Secondly, leverage the tools and resources. They've come so far that people really do have an opportunity to understand it more than they ever have before. And then third, there is a demand and a desire for this information to be incorporated more. And so just embracing that and using this as the opportunity to have more conversations about our employees, about the things we can do for them. This is an opportunity to bring topics like well-being to the table, to really give some insights and some data that can then drive business decisions that would affect employees. So I think it's a scary place to be, but it's also an amazing opportunity. And the more that we can lean into understanding what's going on, the more we'll be able to affect change and to really move it forward.
So one of the things that I think is exciting is the opportunity for making contributions in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there are things that technology are better at than people, and areas that people are better at than technology. Humans obviously are really great at creative and subjective, and technology is very good at scaling and objectivity. So when it comes to topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion, how can technology help us?
I feel very passionately that data and technology has been missing from the inclusion, the belonging conversation. We have been focusing on diversity and inclusion for decades. We have had numbers and values that we have been reporting on those topics for decades, yet progress hasn't seemed to come very far. So it's clearly not just a matter of numbers on a page. It's more about using data and analytics and now technology tools to not just monitor and assess, but to change the situation. So we're seeing this whole new world of what I'd like to call inclusion analytics, where we're able to really understand, are individuals being brought into the conversation? Are they being placed onto important work? Are they given opportunities? These are the metrics that have more to do with inclusion and belonging than some demographic reporting numbers. But it takes a little bit of kind of an advanced approach in order to really pull that off. Because how do you know if a situation is just a one-off or if there are patterns that are problematic in your organization? Patterns are what technology is good at. That's the thing it's good at. It can look over the course of many interactions, many situations, and find those patterns for us. It can identify problems, but it can also be implemented into processes in ways that can remove the bad patterns and maybe increase the good patterns. Technology is a very, very powerful tool, and data as well, but the things that it's good at is identifying and perpetuating patterns. And so in my view, technology, when not built expressly for inclusivity, perpetuates and continues whatever you already have. So if you are very happy with your current environment and culture, well then by all means, assess all of your current data, build a model, and go ahead and put that in place. I promise you, your company will look in the future like it always has in the past. And if that's what you want, great, data can do that well. But if you want a different looking future, data can do that too. We just haven't been taking that approach. If you have data that shows that your patterns are maybe what you'd prefer, that they looked a little different in the future, well, you can actually model that out and say, well, which of our few activities have broken the pattern? Have there been activities that seem to have included more individuals or advanced more types of thought or more ways of thinking? And when you can identify those patterns, well, then you build more of them. You find more opportunities for putting them out there. And this is where data and technology can jump in, spot those for you, and give you the ideas to really drive it forward and to break the status quo. So I think data and technology for belonging, for inclusion, for well-being, all connected back to improving it, can do things that, for those of us like myself who have been in the HR profession, have struggled to do on our own. We've wanted to do these things, but we haven't had enough information or insights about what truly affects change. Data can be gathered and can give us a solid understanding of, hey, these methods work. Hey, these methods don't. And the more that we learn from those, the more we can create what we're looking for in the future.
How do you think that people, data, and analytics can be used across lines of business, finance, HR, sales, and supply chain to help address the needs of talent for the business?
I'm so glad you brought that up. Too often, people analytics is thought of as maybe HR's thing. And there is ownership. HR does have a responsibility to talent, to people, and data and analytics can take it to a whole nother level. But people analytics is really a conversation for every leader in the organization. When I think about different areas like finance, whose sole focus is on our assets, our investments, our value, the number one asset that produces value for an organization is its people. Companies are comprised of the knowledge, the insights, the processes, and the outcomes of people. And to think that the insights and understanding around humans shouldn't be potentially the top most important line item on a balance sheet is baffling. We need to be talking about value, and people are where an organization's value sits. In the same vein, I think about the COOs and the operational approaches to things. Operations is all about people, process, and technology. You can have the best technology, you can have the best processes, you can monitor all of that flow, but if you don't have an understanding of productivity, of the impact of our own talent flows within those processes and the ways that they connect, your systems, your processes, they're not going to work. No matter how you develop that system, if you don't consider how it works together with the people side of things, it won't get to where it needs to go. So when I think about different areas, people analytics informs everything that each function needs to do. It is not an HR conversation. When there is a broad discussion about an organization's success and a topic about people comes up, if everyone's head just turns and stares at the HR leader, well, first of all, that's great because I'm sure they have fantastic insights to provide. But secondly, I would just as quickly turn and ask the finance leader to discuss how our human capital value is performing against expectations and where we see that coming out. I would just as quickly expect our COO to speak up about how our processes are getting the maximum, both productivity, but also the most positive workplace effects for our employees. It's not just an ask to HR of, hey, what's going on over there? It's an ask to every leader about how are we really having a conversation and using data to drive forward our talent.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned people, process, and technology. I know that's terminology that anyone around technology is very familiar with. They're kind of considered the mainstays. I have a lot of conversations with our customers. And there's a company that we work with that is a manufacturer for solar panels. And I thought it was really interesting because we were talking to their CIO and he was saying, for us, it's really about people, process, and purpose. And it's interesting because these days I don't have a conversation with a customer that doesn't include, what the company is thinking about in terms of, environmental, social responsibility, or diversity, equity, inclusion. Like these are topics that are top of mind for all of our customers across every industry, across every geography. And often, what I think is exciting is that, people are really interested in evolving their businesses from a technology point of view. They're interested, obviously in my context, into moving into the cloud so they can have this consolidated data and these insights to be more efficient on the technology side of the business so that they can focus on the larger purpose of the organizations. And every single company that I talk to, they're talking about how they want to evolve the business, evolve the technology to be more efficient so that they can focus on these bigger picture things. I think we're at an interesting place where every company is thinking about their contributions to a larger context. And I think that's really exciting. And I'm curious if you've seen any shifts within the last year in terms of the conversations that you're having with companies and how they're thinking about these larger social issues and what it means, not just in terms of, feeling good for the business, but also trying to do good as an organization as part of a larger strategy to do well as a business.
Yeah, I've definitely seen shifts recently that have been heartening. It's been fantastic to see the emphasis lately on the S and ESG. We are seeing not only more interest in discussions, but we're seeing some action. We're seeing regulators demand information, especially on things like diversity and inclusion. We're seeing investors really putting their money where their mouth is in terms of saying we're going to value and we're going to support organizations that focus on these important broader purpose topics. And more interestingly, and I think this is something that companies should take particular heed to right now with talent demands, is employees are choosing companies that match their values and their beliefs. And we are seeing more employees choosing to join the organizations that match their values on a deeper, more purpose-driven level. And so when you have forces coming from every direction, you have regulators demanding it, you have investors incentivizing it, and you have employees that are choosing, either by leaving or joining, to really get behind this. It's interesting because it's not even just a social good conversation anymore. It's a business imperative in order to have a say in the social side of where your business impacts and what your purpose is. And I think that's only going to grow stronger. We have been noticing that the metrics that are being demanded are getting more and more on the people side. We are seeing more and more requests for whether or not our supply chains are sustainable. We are seeing more and more deep dives into whether or not our people practices are effective, but more importantly, whether or not they are appropriate and ethical. And I think this is going to hopefully create even more of a shift toward not just business for value and for profit, but business for social impact and social connection. And I think that there is a great opportunity for people analytics to play into that by providing some insights into these topics and also giving people something to track and measure and to really ensure that what gets measured might actually happen and have some follow through as well.
How do you think that HR and finance can partner using people analytics to help address some of today's challenges within the business?
We're in probably a perfect time right now for HR and finance to address probably one of our biggest challenges right now, which is talent and skill shortages, how they're affecting our supply chain. Everyone's feeling this right now. And this is a perfect example of where individuals from different functional areas can come together and really address an issue. If HR, finance, and supply chain could get together and work through things like scenario planning and gap analysis, and not just how many people do we have, where do they fit in the process, and how does that work from a financial aspect, but really get into scenarios, get into the what ifs, model out the different potential outcomes. What if we have yet another shift? It's an interesting opportunity to really imagine all the different potential business outcomes, set up some planning, and the practice of modeling out different potential futures by default gives you this understanding of what possibilities and opportunities that you have. And if you can bring the different functions together to talk about gaps and get into what others might consider an intangible measurement conversation, you'd be surprised how far it can go. So skills is the perfect example of measuring intangibles. Skills are a little hard to put your finger on sometimes. How do you know if someone's good or not good? Sure, we have certifications, but most skills that we're concerned about are more broad than that. But if we can take some practices and tips from people analytics approaches, we can work on measuring what skills we have, what skills are needed, but then we can use that collaborative gap analysis and scenario planning to look for opportunities to leverage skills in new ways. Skills are malleable and they're transferable. And there are opportunities that if you sit the right people in the room and talk about enough different possible futures, you may find that you have skills being used in one way today that, should things go really crazy, you might have an opportunity to move them into an adjacent area. You might have an opportunity to leverage them in creative different approaches that you won't see if you sit in your own silos and have discussions about your own areas, coming together as a group, picking a way to think about your business, whether that be skills, whether that be processes, but then having a dialogue about the information itself and planning it out is where you can really partner together and have some really big impacts for what to do with the business, especially in crazy, confusing times like right now.
I think most businesses know they need to be customer-centric, whatever their version of that is. But I think a lot of businesses are realizing that in order to be customer-centric, they also have to be employee-centric. And I'm curious if you've seen, any examples of companies realizing how they can work with their employees to provide a better customer experience.
Yeah, another interesting part of that too is a lot of companies forget that sometimes, depending on their business, their employees are their customers. And there's even opportunities where the lines blur. So for example, if you are hiring and you are interviewing individuals, those individuals may or may not become your employees, but they also may or may not become your customer as a result of the interaction. So I think there's first this idea that Employees might be customers, depending on your product. But then secondly, even if they're not, employees affect everything that we see about a customer relationship. There have been plenty of studies and analyses just showing that happier employees do lead to better outcomes for customers. And we see this not only in, kind of retail settings or direct interactions, but we also see this in areas of the business just functioning better and in empathy coming along too. So I think when you have employees that are treated with empathy, those employees go on to build products, services, and solutions that carry that empathy forward into your outcomes for customers as well. And it's this ripple effect. It also can be a bit of a circular process where then by your impact into your external customers has an effect back into the organization with better interactions as well.
Companies that have access to employee data, what do you think is the responsibility of companies in protecting sensitive data about employees?
Yeah, when I think of people analytics, I usually have a few of my own personal tenets that I try to follow. And one of those is people data is not like other data. And I think we've talked a little bit about that and the difficulty of intangibles. But another one is people data is private data. This is information that can be used to affect someone's livelihood, their lives. It's also private information, and some of it shouldn't be gathered or used, but a lot of it can be used, again, for people rather than just about them. And it all comes back to trust. So there's been some really interesting analyses these days being done around understanding networks and how employees work together and collaborate. And in those conversations, what they found is the data that is coming out of these analyses is only valid when there's trust in the organization. When employees don't trust their organization, it doesn't matter how many surveys you put out there. It doesn't matter how many times you try to measure something. You will never get a true response. You will get the response that they have been conditioned to give you just so that you'll leave them alone. Trust is required for good people analytics. And one of the first things that you can do to build that trust is do no harm with the data. If employees believe that their data is going to be used in ways that can harm them, they're not going to be forthcoming with the information. Secondly, it's follow compliance and best practices. There are regulations, there are privacy controls, and those should be taken very seriously. And more than that, to involve the employees. Trust is a two-way conversation. If you're always doing analytics on someone, that is different than doing it with employees. So the more that we can introduce employees into the conversation, the more that we can build that trust and connect it. I mentioned my tenets. I'll just add that one of the other ones I stick to is I have a motto of don't be creepy. So every time that I think I want to analyze something, I step back and I ask myself, is this creepy? Is this weird? Like, if I measured this, would anyone be like, what? Why are you asking me that? And that's sort of my own test, because if I'm doing something creepy, some of the employees are going to feel that along the way. And that goes back to trust. We should be doing things that people are comfortable with, that help them, and that are connected along the way.
A big thing for us, a big focus for us with the cloud platform is that you have all of your data consolidated. It's like you have every line of business consolidated. You have HR, finance. Like, in order to be able to do a lot of this analysis, you have to have all the data together and make sure that it's consistent. I mean, we've worked with customers in the past who their HR and their finance systems don't match up. Even the number of employees that they have or how much they're paying people. I mean, it's frightening, often how inaccurate critical information can be. And so I'm curious, in the work that you've done in companies that you've worked with, is there a benefit to having like a cloud platform, having something that's consolidated and that you can bring together data across lines of business and sort of reconcile all that information to then be able to plan for the entire business?
Yeah, I'm part of this alliance, this People Intelligence Alliance. And it's funny, one of the first conversations that we had when people enthusiasts from all over were getting together was we realized that the foundation of good people analytics is going to be made or broken on the notion of interoperability of data. If our data cannot be connected and we can't make sense of it across the systems, we're not going to get very far. Because if you've got just some HR data sitting over here, you've got some finance data over here, you've got some operations data over there, that's all good and well, but you're never going to get the full holistic systems thinking approach that is powerful with it. With our advances in technology, with more cloud computing and opportunities for really connecting and creating that interoperability, that's where I think most of the people analytics value is going to come in. It's not going to come from a single analysis. It's not going to come from a single prediction. It's going to come from this interconnection between the information from the different parts of the business really working together. I read this study that came out a few years ago, and they surveyed executives, and the number one thing that was requested was more collaboration between C-suite members. And the number two was people data. And so if we think about what we really need to transform the way we're thinking of our organizations, it's that collaboration informed by data. It's evidence-based decisions that connect all of the pieces. And the people part is what connects all of the pieces. It is what's connected across there. So I think technology is going to be the thing that helps us create that cross-collaboration, that helps create the interconnectedness that maybe some of the current state silos, especially in how the data is kept, stored, and assessed, might be hindering a little today.
Key feedback that we hear from our customers is actually how important having modern tools is to their employee experience. That if they're trying to attract and retain employees who are consumers in their personal lives, who are used to modern technologies and modern experiences, they have those expectations for having that type of technology in their work environment. So I think that sort of the tools and the experience that employees have often has a lot to do with employee engagement. What are the other common factors that you see that are directly tied to employee engagement?
I think that's such a great point. I mean, employees are people living in the real world. And so when they're outside of the office, they're having these experiences. They're having recommenders telling them, hey, watch this. You might like to eat this. You might want to buy that. And they do a fairly good job. You know, they offer you up all these ideas, and in some ways it feels like they know you and they're offering up suggestions. Then these same people go to the workplace, and here's an organization that has so much data about you. They have your resume, they have performance evaluations, they have all this information, yet they still don't seem to know what job you might be suited for best. They still might not seem to provide you a recommendation of skills that you might need to learn and grow. Maybe even recommending a mentor or a colleague that you can connect with. These are actually things that are possible and are very much within our reach using people analytics. And they're also somewhat expected by employees. These people spend their lives being connected and having data help support their decision making, only to find themselves in the workplace sometimes lacking the tools that give them the information and the suggestions that they need. So the more that we can use data and technology to bring the employee experience more up to the standards that the customer experience has placed it at, the more we're going to see just a positive impact in employees feeling connected, being able to develop, having the tools and the resources they need, and the tools that help them do their work best and feel connected.
We spoke earlier about the fact that technology can really influence behavior in a positive or negative way. If you were to speak to the creators of technology, the designers of technology, what would be your request to them as to ways that they can make sure that the technology that they create is having a positive impact instead of a negative impact?
Yeah, I love that question. I think the answer was there in the question as well. It's that word impact. Too often we focus on output, or we focus on product, or we focus on quality. I kind of like to pull from the sciences here for a minute, but there is a concept of statistical significance, and it's this idea that mathematically something makes sense. And then there's this idea of practical significance, which as business leaders, that's, is it feasible? Is it viable? Do my customers even want it? But I think what I'd want technology leaders and just business leaders in general to consider is maybe the idea of social significance, which is, what is the impact? Not just, is this going to be useful? Not just, is this going to be high quality? But is this going to affect people? And if so, in what ways? And are those the ways that we want them to be? And there's this idea behind impact and accountability, that if we approach all of our data and technology decisions with an idea of how will this impact, we might find that we build things in very different ways. And I think the power lies in asking that question is, what's the social impact?
And what's your recommendation for senior leadership in each line of business?
For my HR colleagues, take the reins. Be bold. You have such a unique opportunity to use data to really drive the company forward, and you have responsibility for the largest asset that the organization has. Take this opportunity to drive and to lead. And for my finance friends, I would say get comfortable with intangibles. Measuring people's messy, but that's okay. We can get into those conversations and go deeper. And then for my operations friends and on the product side, it's really thinking about the people side. Not just technology, not just process, but where do the people come in? And I think even with other lines of businesses and across, the biggest takeaway is just going to be that collaboration. We all have a role to play in the people side of our business. And so the more we can approach cross collaboration in the idea of how we think about people, that's going to have the biggest outcome.
Heather, this was great. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It was a wonderful conversation.